Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our series on in-depth analysis of the Sicilian defense, and we're going to be going over one of the most popular and most requested lines that comes from the Sicilian defense, and that is the Najdorf variation. It's one of the most well-respected defenses that you'll see in chess. It's played on all levels of chess, even up to the top. You've probably seen many of Garry Kasparov's games, Bobby Fischer's games, two players that really enjoyed this defense. It's one of the most sound defenses that you will see. There's so much theory on it. I feel like it would be a disservice not to do a video on it and kind of explain some of the concepts and some of the main lines and ideas to think about when you're playing. So it starts out with pawn 2e4, pawn 2c5. Again, this is the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, simple development, pawn to d6, pawn d4. After black captures, white recaptures. Black's now going to come to f6 for simple development, and after the knight's going to come to c3. The Najdorf defense continues with pawn to a6, and this is really where we're going to start getting into different variations of the Najdorf defense. Now, if you're not too familiar with the Sicilian defense or the Najdorf variation in general, you may look at this and say, a6, is this really one of the most respected defenses in all of chess? It's just a little move, a6 right here. And the answer is yes. And as far as the Sicilian in general, keep in mind the Sicilian is a very sharp line. Typically you see both sides trying to control the other side. White's trying to control the king side. Black's really trying to control the queen side, trying to control this semi-open c-file, really trying to attack the queen side of white, where typically white is castled. From here, this pawn here on a6 has a lot of different ideas. The first thing, as you can see, it's blocking off this outpost on both of his knights. This knight can't come here, knight can't come here. There's not a lot of good squares for the knight to come to. Right now we are still blocking with our pawn here on b7. It cannot come to this c6 square, and it would really like to come to this b5 square. Also keep in mind that since black does have these light squares open, attacking the king here, a lot of times in other variations of the Sicilian, the white bishop really likes to come down to b5 and harass the heck out of the black king. In this variation, obviously you can see it's blocking that as well. So not only is it a great pawn placement as far as blocking our opponent, anytime you can block your opponent from some of the themes they would like to do, that's a good thing. Not always going forward with what you want, but if you can stop them, that's good as well. But it also has other ideas as well. Typically black would like to bring his pawn, push it forward to b5. Again, black in the Sicilian is always trying to counterattack. It's one of the most aggressive defenses that black has. You definitely don't want to play it if you're passive. So being able to push forward with b5, really starting to push on the attack on the queen side, it's definitely helpful for that. Once black does have this pawn here on b5, he does have different options. He can always bring now a knight here on c4 as an outpost. He obviously still has the knight here on c5 because of his pawn there on d6. So he has all these different options. Obviously, once the pawn comes to b5 as well, he can also bring his light square bishop into the action. So he can bring it to b7 if he wants to, start to put a lot of pressure. Once he has both of his minor pieces, he can now get his rook involved into the game, trying to control again this semi-open c-file. So black has a lot of different ideas just from this simple move of a6. Now, obviously we do want to talk about white. White has a lot of different options just from this particular standpoint as we look at it right here in the Najdorf variation. And that's kind of where we're going to go. We're going to go a lot of different areas. We do have the old mainline defense that you've seen a lot from white as far as countering this. You do have the new modern line that you'll see a lot. And then you have another variation called the Fischer-Sozin attack, and that's kind of another variation we're going to look at. So we're going to go ahead and start off with the old main line in the Najdorf defense from white after black plays a6. Now the old main line from white starts with bishop to g5. Now this is the most aggressive line that white has against the Sicilian. Obviously keeping in mind that Sicilian is very aggressive. Typically nowadays from white you may see a little bit more passive move instead of, again, this is the old main line. Nowadays you may see, bishop to e3 instead of to g5. Nowadays I personally feel like some of the GMs don't try to get too cute. They try to kind of play subtle in the beginning, trying to really build up strong structure, go into this deep analysis of middle game. That's fine, Danny, but anytime I see someone come out, top level play that just plays bishop to g5, basically saying I'm going all out, I'm going as aggressive as I can against the Sicilian defense. It's really fun to see. There's not a lot of draws in these games. There's so many tactical errors that can be made. It's just really fun to watch. So personally, I play against a lot of aggressive players, so I see this line more times than not. If you've played the Najdorf defense, you've probably seen it a lot. So from here, Black does have a few different options. One of his options is to play pawn to e6. Again, getting ready to obviously defend this knight with either his queen on d8. He can always bring his bishop here to e7 to defend it. More likely than not, after Black plays pawn to e6, White's not going to capture. Obviously, the higher you get up in chess, typically players don't like to give up their bishops early on as far as trading them with their knights. And that is simply because you can open up the board a lot easier than you can close it, since bishops do better in open games. If someone has a bishop pair, typically they will try to open up the game, and then they will have a very big advantage if they do have that bishop pair. So just something to keep in mind in the back of your head. Now from here, if we look at from White, if we think about the ideas that really White has, as you can see, the bishop can't really, as far as being aggressive, again, if you're going to play this bishop to g5, that means you're kind of being aggressive. So there's no reason now to play bishop to b2. It's kind of a little bit too passive. Bringing it to c4, it's trying to eye down on that f7 square, but again, the e6 pawn is protecting it. It can't come to b5. Not a lot of good squares. So typically you start to either see, pawn to f4. Some players play, queen to f3 if they're not comfortable pushing the pawn forward, but the most common is pawn to f4. Again, really trying to push on the king side. White will eventually castle on the queen side and really try to just massacre Black on the king side. Now from here, Black does have a few different options. One of his moves, he can come to e7, as we talked about before, again defending his knight here on f6. From here, White can now bring his queen to f3, again developing his pieces, getting ready to castle on the queen side. From here, Black has two different options. One is to bring his queen to b6. Again, you have to counterplay. You can't just stay passive the entire time as a Sicilian. That's really not what it's there for. So again, putting a lot of pressure on this b2 pawn. And from here, White is going to castle on the queen side. Now from here, Black has a few options, but he can always bring his knight to d7. Again, trying to add more pressure onto this knight on f6. Obviously, he can also, if he wants to push forward in time, with pawn to e5. Now, besides playing bishop to e7, a lot of times Black has the option of bringing his queen to b6. If you've ever heard of the poison pawn in the Najdorf defense, this is what it refers to, bringing the queen to b6. This is one of Garry Kasparov's go-to defenses. So anytime he comes out and says, hey, in the Najdorf defense, this is pretty much what I'm going to play, this is what I've studied and what I think it's the best, I pretty much am going to agree with him. He was pretty good at chess. So take it for that what you will and play whichever variation you want. But from here, White's going to continue with queen to d2. He's going to allow the queen to come to b2 and take this pawn on b2 in exchange for trying to control the center of the board with development and his pieces and pawns. So the queen's now going to come to queen to b2, and the rook's going to come to b1. Obviously, the queen's going to have to kick back on a3. And then White's going to start to push forward. He can either push forward with f5 or he can push forward with e4. Keep in mind, from White, if you do see this or you're playing against this, Black is now up in material. So you did not sacrifice this extra pawn on b2 for nothing. Anytime you're going to gambit a piece or give up a piece or pawn, any type of material, it needs to have some sort of compensation. In this case, White's really going to try to pound away on the king side of Black. So as you can see the dynamics here, this is a very aggressive line for both sides. White can no longer castle on the queen side. His rook has moved. So again, this is going to be a little bit different. There's a hole now on semi-open file on the C file. White has a semi-open file on the B file, so the queen side is going to be fireworks all over the place, and white's controlling the center of the board, even though black is up in material. So, Garry Kasparov, enjoy this, but it does get kind of crazy. So just keep that in mind if you do play the poison pawn variation. Another variation that you may see is the Argentine variation, and that starts out with bishop to e7, as we talked about before in the main line, and then the queen is going to come to f3 again. But from here, instead of bringing the queen out to b6, as we talked about before, or even c7 if you want to, from here black's going to play pawn to h6. Now, I know many people, anytime your opponent tries to pin down your knight, you just immediately play h6 or you play a6, depending on if he's pinning down the knight to the queen or the king. In this case, this is probably one of the more wild, crazy, chaotic variations that you will see. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Again, if white chooses to exchange, anytime someone exchanges their bishop for your knight early on, hey, that's a win for you. Again, try to open up the game and really use your bishop pair. Typically, you won't see someone do that if they know what they're doing, if they're familiar with chess. So in this case, you might see the bishop come back to h4. Again, this is the main line in the Argentine variation. Black's now going to play pawn to g5, again, really breaking this up. Now, as you can start to see already, black typically castles on the king side in the Sicilian defense. So this is pretty much just breaking everything up, especially after pawn takes on g5. As you can already see, black's not looking to castle on the king side anymore. So anytime someone basically says, hey, I'm not going to castle where I'm planning on to, and none of these pieces, the queen, bishop, and knight, are developed, so it's going to take me a long time to castle on the other side with this C file open, you pretty much know black's saying, hey, I'm going all out, I may not even castle, and there's just going to be fireworks. So if you like chaos, hey, try this defense out. It's kind of entertaining. So from here, black's going to play knight to d7, a very important move, getting his knight out of the way, also getting ready if he wants to come to e5, and he's also allowing the bishop and the queen now to both eye down on this dark square diagonal. If he wants to take on here on g5, he can also take here on h4 if this pawn moves. So very important move to bring the knight back to d7. From here, white's going to actually capture on e6. And black is going to recapture with his pawn here on e6. Now, if white's not too familiar, he could definitely make a mistake here. If he does not see that it's actually a good move to take on e6, but obviously if black captures, you may be thinking, I don't understand, why would white give up material here? As you can see, he's really opening up all these lines here. His queen can now come to h5, attacking the king here on e1. The king's going to have to come to f8, and then the light square bishop can come to b5. Now, even if you look at this, you'd say, Kevin, I don't understand. Why would you bring your bishop to b5? Like, you're just asking for it to be taken right here with this pawn here on a6. But what it does is it also allows you to open up the door if you want to castle on the king side. You can also just bring the rook to f1. It's going to be really, really hard for black to cope with all of the stuff that you have going on here. Obviously, white has the queen here on h5. A lot going on. From Fischer actually came up with the best refutation of this, and that is, instead of taking with the pawn here on b5, is actually to play rook to h7. And this is really the saving grace for black. It really sets up if he needs to defend. If the rook comes to f1, it kind of gives him the ability to swing this over if he needs to. Obviously, he can bring his king to g8 if he needs to, but it really protects this key square here of the f7 square. As we talked about before, if the rook was on f1 and then the queen came down to f2, it would be checkmate. So this rook here on h7 is going to be huge. Obviously, as we talked about before, white gave up material playing this knight here taking on e6 and with black recapturing. So as you can see, this definitely doesn't look good for black. I'm not going to sit here and say this is a fantastic situation, but black is up in material, and he does have the ability to save face here. So Fisher has played this, and he says this is a legitimate play, h7, to protect the house here, if you will. But you definitely are going to have to be, aggressive for black. You're definitely going to have to start to push forward. Obviously, you're attacking this bishop here on b5. White's going to have to do something about that. Black's definitely going to have to start to get his other pieces involved, really start to get some counterplay, or he will get crushed here on the king side, especially if white decides to castle on the queen side, get both of the rooks involved. It's definitely going to be chaotic, but I kind of told you that going into this variation. So this is the old main line. We're going to go ahead and now get into the new main line that you'll see a lot in high level play. The new main line starts with bishop to e3 in this position, a little less aggressive than if the bishop came down to g5. It's still not blocked by the pawn structure. Obviously the pawn has come out to e4, so it won't be blocked off, but typically in high level play nowadays you'll see a little bit more passive approach. Not to say that the Sicilian is passive, but compared to bishop to g5, typically players at top level aren't trying to play the most aggressive openings anymore. That's not to say that e3 is not a good move. It's just not nearly as aggressive as the old main line. From here, black has a few options. So if you do see the bishop come to e3, you do have a few options. You can always bring your pawn to e5. Really try to, block this knight here on d4. He really has no problems coming back to b3 anyway. This is kind of where he's comfortable. From here, black can start to just develop his pieces. Again, bishop to e6. Obviously trying to get his knight involved into the game, trying to bring his rook to c8, trying to control this semi-open file. He's eventually going to bring his bishop into the game over here, maybe bishop to e7, castle on the king side, still trying to attack on the queen side. So still some of the same theory behind the typical Sicilian Najdorf defense. From here you may see the pawn come to f3, trying to not only defend this pawn here on e4, but also trying to stop the knight here coming to g4. As another variation that we'll get to in a second, instead of e4, you can always play knight to g4. Kind of, annoying if you see it as white, knight coming to g4, which is why I actually prefer playing that. So this is why you might see pawn coming to f3. Again, if you do see pawn coming to f3, this typically means that white's not going to castle on the king side. If he does, this is not really aggressive. You might want to push it forward to f4, open up the f file for your rook here. Playing f3 and then castling on the king side is kind of weak sauce. You're really not helping your protection of the king side, and you're not really also making it aggressive for your rook as well. So this typically means they're going to castle on the queen side. From here, black can continue with knight to d7. Again, he can always bring it to c6 if he wants to, but this will allow him to bring his rook right away to c8 and really control that long semi-open file. From here you may see queen come to d2, getting ready to castle on the queen side. From here black can really start to push forward. He can bring his pawn to b5. Again, he can always bring his rook to c8 if he wants to. A lot of times you will see this push to b5 right away, kind of hoping that white will castle on the queen side first, and then, because if you see that, then black can push forward with b3, kind of an annoying move. Again, white now has to move his knight here. So instead, a lot of times from white, you will see a3 first, or you may even see a4 first, putting a lot of pressure on black, trying to have him decide where he wants to go. Now obviously if these come off the board, then white may revisit the option of castling on the king side. Obviously if he's going to give up this this long a file or semi-open a file, it's going to be much harder to protect the queen side. So depending on his idea of how he wants to attack, he can either castle on the queen side or he can push up with this a pawn to a3. A lot of times you may also just see a4, really trying to put a lot of pressure on black. So very common just to see a4. Now if we come back here, as we talked about before, black has the option of coming forward with e5. He can also either just come to e6, or a lot of times I actually recommend playing knight to g4. This is kind of a pain in the rear for white. Obviously you're trying to exchange pieces. You're trying to exchange your knight for the bishop. As we talked about before, early on this is advantageous if you can trade those off, even though they are technically both worth 3 points. Now this knight is being protected by the bishop here on c7. If you've watched the other dragon variation, you know that from here white can always come down and check the king here on b5. But the great thing about the Najdorf defense is this pawn here on a6. Again, very, very key outpost here on b5 that it's protecting. So black no longer has to worry about the bishop coming down to b5, which makes the knight here on g4 that much more fun to harass the bishop here on e3. So from here, white can continue with bishop to g5, black can continue with h6, then bishop h4. Again, these are standard moves. Pawn to g5. The white bishop is just going to be kicked back. Black's now going to play bishop to g7. The reason I like this is a way, if your opponent starts with bishop to e3, basically going into the new main line of the Sicilian defense Najdorf variation from white, basically saying, I don't want to be that aggressive. Well, this is a way to say, you know what, I'm going to take that and I'm going to be even more aggressive with it. As you can tell, black has the ability to start pushing forward on the queen side, but black's already starting to push forward on the king side as well, which, as you can tell, this is going to be a much more aggressive defense from black. His king defense is going to be not as strong. He's really going to be looking to push forward. White doesn't have as strong a center control here. Again, he can always push forward with his pawn on e5, kick this knight off. He can start to develop his pieces. So this is going to be a very, very aggressive line from black here. Now also keep in mind, if you look at this, that white does still have the option here to castle on the king side. So you're not really sure where white's going to end up. He hasn't moved any of his pawns on the f file. So there's a lot of different options. This is kind of why I like this idea in the new main line. Now the next idea is the Fischer-Sosen attack. It's a different variation than we've seen before, so I'll go ahead and get into that. Now you won't see this variation as much, but anytime Fischer's named after a variation, I feel obligated to talk about it, since he spent time to analyze it and deemed it necessary to play a lot. We'll go ahead and talk about it. And that is, instead of actually bringing the dark squared bishop into the game, he's going to bring the light squared bishop into the game. He's going to attack this f7 square right away. Now obviously this is the weakest square from black in the early part of the game. So first thing black wants to do is he wants to thwart that attack, and he's going to play pawn to e6. Typical logical move, again, making it very hard to continue to attack this. From here, white's going to push back. He's going to play bishop to b3. This is very, very common for Fischer. Anytime you've seen him play, he likes to bring his bishop out to c4, and then he kicks it back to b3 and just tries to harass this long, light diagonal the entire game. Now, why does he play this right away? He could always castle on the king side, but he really doesn't want the pawn to come to b5 with tempo. So instead, he just goes ahead and brings his bishop back to b3. He doesn't want to. He could do them either way, but he's like, you know what, I'm going to come back to b3, because if he doesn't come push forward with b5, we may want to have different options. We may want to castle on the queen side. We may want to do something else. That's why the bishop's coming back to b3 first, and not allowing black to push forward and making that choice for white. So from here, typically you'll see either bishop to e7. If you're really aggressive, you may just want to start pushing forward with b5, really starting that attack here. White can do a lot of things. He can bring his bishop, if he wants, down to g5. He can castle on the king side. So a lot of different ideas from both different sides. Again, you won't see this as often as the old main line and the new main line. But if you do see it, or you play even as white, and you want to change it up a little bit, definitely feel free to give this a shot and let me know what you guys think. So This is the Najdorf defense. Definitely tons and tons of theory behind it. I definitely recommend checking out the website, looking at some of the famous games that have been used playing these. See some of the ideas and concepts that they used in the middle game going into the end game. Some phenomenal games that have been played using the Najdorf defense. And even if you keep up with tournaments nowadays, it's played all the time. So definitely check some of those out and be thinking about these ideas as you watch the game. Like, oh wow, that's totally cool. It's definitely more entertaining once you know what's going on and what they're thinking about during the game. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. There'll be tons of more later on. Definitely check out the website if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.